Hi everyone, it's been a minute since I made a video about ASG, and I'm really sorry about that. Life gets a little hectic, and to be completely honest, video editing isn't exactly my forte, so I tend to kind of put it off. Today I want to give an update about where I'm at with the project and my recent progress. So unfortunately, the game has been in development for quite a long time. I think we're hitting like 5 years, and life unfortunately has a way of getting in the way, but I am determined to finish it by the end of the year. Will I succeed on that? I'm not sure. Honestly, who knows? The current step of the game, though, is playtesting and balance, which I think, as of the time recording this, I'm mostly wrapped up with, but I will need a second playtesting phase. But I really want to get into talking about how I did it, my approach to things, and some of my opinions. And before I talk about the specifics of my process, I really want to just talk about balance as a whole and how I view it. I'm not exactly a game design expert or anything, but I do have some opinions from actual experience here. Balance is a really important tool in game design, but I feel there's a few pitfalls to avoid. Balance in of itself needs its own sort of balance and direction. It's really important to avoid overcorrecting the design and stripping out all of the fun parts, while also not falling into the trap of balance doesn't matter. You need to decide exactly what type of experience you're trying to create and how balance is going to help you achieve that. It is a tool. The reason I bring this up is because I often see some interesting discussion around balance, which is some people kind of go, well, it's a PvE game, why does balance matter? And I think the easy answer to that one is because you want all of the players to feel equally important or powerful. You're probably not going to have a perfectly balanced party of completely equally competent characters. But they'll have different strengths and weaknesses, and there will be places where one character is strong and another one falls flat. Ideally, you want it so that their characters always have some place that they can shine, where they can be in the spotlight and be at their best. And that spotlight in tabletop RPGs should be shared. On the other hand, it can be kind of easy to go overboard and try to make everything so optimally balanced that you start stripping out mechanics that are unique and interesting because they don't quite neatly fit into your design. As well as sometimes design, I think, is looked at from almost the wrong angle. Like, people kind of take a balancing approach that you might see in like competitive PvP games, and they try to bring it into a tabletop RPG where the style of play is completely different. So it's important that you actually narrow in on what you want to make your game about. You're going to see wildly different types of designs from a hardcore fantasy dungeon crawler versus a sci-fi tactics game. They're trying to achieve different things, and they need a different approach. So for All Systems Go, I've always wanted a heroic power fantasy. That was from the very beginning. I want player characters to feel stronger than average and allow them to take on missions that no one else is capable of. This is not about creating a game where there is no friction or no challenge. The challenge comes from fighting against overwhelming numbers and strategizing about how they can win when the odds seem against them. The main way I've always achieved this is through grunts, which are weaker foes that can be ran in greater numbers. Currently, it's balanced for about 2 grunts to 1 player character. For a well-optimized party, it might honestly be 3 grunts per player character. You can of course mix in enemy aces and rivals, which are a newer mechanic, which I'll talk about in a different video. My point is that the players are always fighting larger groups than themselves. Grunts have been designed in a way that makes it relatively easy for the GM to run them. They don't track ammo, they don't track armor or durability, they go down in 1 or 2 hits. The key to actually using them in fun combats is to use a little bit of tactics, recognize the strengths of each grunt unit, and to mix them together in interesting ways that kind of creates a combat puzzle for the players to solve. Not to mention, conditions in the game can be rather powerful, and a couple of conditions in the right place can swing combat around relatively quickly. Players and the narrator are going to have to learn how these conditions work, and learn how to use them. So far, this has created a very fun experience where the conditions and the state of play can change quite a lot from round to round, but also where players can actually use a certain degree of tactics to win over combats that should be much harder. And I think it's important that all of these elements come together as part of the balancing for this heroic power fantasy. It's not just that they're outnumbered. It's not just that grunts are easier to take down. It's also that player characters have wounds, they have drive, they have additional mechanics which make them stronger, which allow them to go for longer during fights, during excursions that regular pilots couldn't. But a power fantasy, I think, still needs tension and friction. You need the chance of failure. You need the possibility that things do not go your way. So next, I actually want to talk about the process. I honestly didn't understand how to go about prototyping and testing games before I started this project. I ran a campaign for quite a few years, and we did a lot of testing in between, but it wasn't as effective as the last 4 months have been. This recent prototyping and playtesting phase has really opened my eyes about the value of rapid prototyping and quick iteration. This might seem like a no-brainer, but when I started this project, I more or less bumbled my way through things. My new methodology is honestly pretty simple. I create characters, I run test battles against roughly appropriately leveled enemies, and I record a lot of data. I mean a lot. I take notes for every single test and document anything of note from problematic abilities to loopholes in the rules to issues in the core design. I keep track of every single detail. Even damage, how much HP characters lost, how much they recovered, ammunition, etc. When I start to see a major issue, or even small ones, I begin deconstructing them to figure out why it's a problem, and I start coming up with solutions that might possibly fix it. Once I've got some solutions, I see which one I kind of like, or am perhaps just leaning towards, and I start doing additional playtesting with experimental rules. It's important to note, these rules do not go into the book until they've been fully tested, but instead, I'm treating it kind of like a little sandbox or a playground where I can give these rules trial runs before full implementation. And if a rule doesn't work, I just toss it out. You do this repeatedly until you start to find rules that feel more solid and consistent, that achieve what you're trying to do. This has allowed me to constantly iterate and redesign without much actual work. It's giving me instant results, and I can see how they play out in a live test. Now I will note, once I've kind of got some rules solidified, I do tend to do additional testing. I like to be thorough about this, so even once I think a rule is working well, I will also test it in a variety of other configurations, with other variables, until I get to something that feels satisfying, or at least that I've essentially vetted the rule and I know it's good enough. That all brings me to the massive playtesting phase that I have been doing so far. And honestly, if I tried to cover every change I made, I think I'd need a whole video series, so I'm just going to paraphrase what I can here. The first thing I did was I ran mid-level solo tests, around rank 10 out of 20, to see how the game felt not only with solo play, but also to see how certain builds felt in isolation. Namely, I was very focused on defensive builds that emphasize avoiding damage altogether. These have always been a problem. In a lot of kinds of games that I've played, they're a problem, but even in my playtesting, in my campaigns, they were a problem. So one of the first major changes I made was to armor and durability. In the old system, armor was damage reduction, and durability was your actual hit points, but this had some serious problems. High armor was generally oppressive and multiplied your effective durability substantially, while low armor was extremely unfun to play as you get torn to shreds in no time. And this created massive divides between characters and their ability to survive fights. It also could become a bit boring for the high armor characters, as they never really feel like they're getting whittled down, and often they're more or less indestructible. After a long series of experiments, I decided that the best choice would be to make armor a secondary HP bar that recovers between fights. The way I explain this in the lore fiction is that armor is actually an energy field that recharges, but it doesn't recharge on a turn-by-turn basis, it instead recharges after several minutes. This system worked a lot better than I actually expected. It enabled player characters to take chip damage more frequently, and also created a new dynamic to play around in the form of the armor. Abilities can now bypass armor altogether or do bonus damage to armor through properties like rending or piercing. In addition, it paved the way for more interesting modules and options that could spend or replenish armor. Grunts still use a simplified version of this mechanic. They have durability and armor, but they're just numbers you need to beat. So let's say a grunt has 3 armor and 3 durability, for simplicity. If you do 4 damage, then you just break the armor, and the grunt gets the compromise condition, and they're going to need another 3 damage hit to kill them. Or, if your first attack did 6, it just depletes them immediately. This lets grunts have a similar mechanic where armor piercing and armor rending still matter, but you don't have nearly as much tracking. You're only tracking whether or not they're compromised or dead. That's it. And speaking of grunts, one of the next things I did was tuning them. I wanted to ensure that grunts are easy to design as a GM, since you'll likely be making new ones relatively frequently to keep the play experience fresh and interesting. They need to grow with the player characters to give them a steady challenge throughout the campaign. To do that, though, I needed to create an average party. I built 4 characters: a sniper, a gunner, a melee pilot, and a drone support. And I made several copies of each, with different ranks so I could test the balanced party against various tiers of grunts. I'm still fine-tuning the grunts, but these tests helped immensely. I was able to tweak and adjust their numbers until I felt that the grunts were actually making enough of an impact to add a little tension to drain the resources of the player characters. And while these changes seem relatively big, the biggest change? The core mechanic. You might be wondering why I would change the core mechanic so late into design, and for one, this isn't the first time that's happened, but 2, because the playtesting revealed some problems. You see, the old core mechanic used a 2d10. You would add your relevant bonuses and divide the total by 5. And truth be told, it did work well at first. Dividing by 5 isn't that big of an ask, however, it can be taxing at times, and it is an additional math step that threw people off. Bonuses could get quite high, like a 13 or 14 at the end of the game, and adding that on to something like 17 isn't incredibly difficult, but it does slow things down. You then ask a player to divide, and some people will just get stuck for a surprising amount of time. And speed was one of the original priorities for All Systems Go when I started making it, and still is, to be honest. So, despite it working, I felt that it had to go. I experimented with several versions until I reached the current system. I wanted to make sure that this system would almost seamlessly fit with the current mark system as well, because that part I felt still worked just fine. Instead of a 2d10 plus a bonus, your skill is rated by a die size, starting at d4 and going all the way up to d12s. Mechanics like expertise and mastery give you extra dice. Your Heartsu will also give you extra dice as well, so for example, if you have a d6 in melee, if you make a melee attack, you get that extra d6 as part of the check. However, with this dice pool, which I call a dice array in the game, you always take the highest result. So adding extra dice gives you improved odds of rolling higher, but doesn't increase the maximum for the most part. There is a little bit of a bonus. If any die rolls its max value, such as an 8 on a 1d8, you get a +1 to the total. This just kind of helps reward incredibly lucky results by pushing them a little bit further than they normally would. However, where this system really differs is the division is gone. You roll those dice, pick the highest, add whatever modifiers you have for conditions or circumstantial bonuses, and that's it. That's the number of marks you have. In combat, your opponent will probably roll a defense check, and that just reduces your offense check by that number of marks. So let's say I'm attacking, I roll a 7, and my opponent rolls a 4. Well, I've got 3 marks to spend. I can then decide if I want to spend those on conditions, damage, or some other options that my tricks give me. And with that, of course, the mark economy had to be adjusted as well. Almost everything was doubled. However, some abilities became 1 or 3 marks. A lot of conditions became 1, as I wanted to encourage people to use conditions more than just going for raw damage. And some things are so powerful that I thought 3 marks would be more appropriate. While I was at it, I thought that damage needed to be changed as well. It wasn't uncommon to see well-built characters deal 20 or 30 damage per attack by stacking a large number of dice. This also drastically increased the value of spending your marks on damage, because why would you take a condition when you can just more or less double or even triple your damage and kill a target outright? On the flip side, characters who weren't really spec'd to do damage were often only dealing like somewhere between 5 and 8, which could feel kind of unsatisfying. This large discrepancy between characters might seem okay in some systems, but I personally just didn't enjoy it. Building off of the dice array system, damage works in a similar way. Every time you add damage, you don't total it. You roll them all in a large pool and pick the highest ones out of the pool. At first, it might seem like it's a little pointless to add more damage to your roll because you're not actually increasing the maximum, but it increases your odds substantially by adding even 1, 2, 3, or 4 dice. And in a lot of cases, the dice that you will be adding might actually be bigger than your base die. So if you have a hit, you have, like, let's say a d6, your crit might be a d10, at which point you are actually increasing the maximum potential roll. Overall, these changes have led to massive improvements in the flow of play. Not only is it speedier, it's just a lot more fun. It's less tedious. And because of these changes, I went a little overboard. A new mark economy really meant that I had to overhaul a lot of tricks and modules anyways, and after substantial testing, one of the things that I really noticed was how many abilities were simply passive. I don't hate passive abilities, but in a game where every character is essentially just rolling to attack, and is just spending marks on abilities, I felt it was really important to give a lot of options that interacted with the resources, whether those be marks, ammo, or energy. I'll have to discuss those in another video, but essentially I've overhauled them completely, and most of the game is now built around picking which options you want to have available. I'm very excited to show some of that off. I still have a lot of playtesting to go through. I need to finish up my current campaign and hopefully run a new one with new players, and of course there will have to be adjustments as I explore more options in the game and start to see how they interact. I haven't explored every single item because I think I'm at around 80 tricks, 75 modules, and 40 weapon mods. Testing all of those is probably not even possible, at least for me, in a reasonable amount of time. Regardless, point is, I will be revisiting the playtesting, but after this major push, I really need a break from it. Anyways, that's more or less all for this update video. Just a friendly reminder, I do have a Patreon where I post occasional uploads and progress reports on the project, as well as some of my art. I used to post some less than safe for work stuff on there, but I've put that to the side to focus on ASG instead. So if you'd like to support the development of the project, you can do so over there, or just follow along with the videos and I'd be more than happy. Anyways, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for listening to me ramble. Peace out.